the station yard had been converted into a relocation checkpoint months earlier, when the interior districts began receiving evacuees faster than billets could be cleared for them. And the yard now operated as a hybrid of rail platform, ration office, and administrative funnel. Blackout curtains hung across the shattered station windows to keep light from escaping at night, and during the day, coal smoke drifted from a metal drum stove where clerks warmed their hands between shifts. Civilians queued in narrow columns that bent around crates of field equipment and bundles of blankets delivered by quartermasters, and each civilian carried some combination of identity cards, ration slips, district codes, SU and carbon copies that served as proof of extraction eligibility. A chalkboard leaned against the freight shed wall, listing the next convoy departure and the sectors for which seats had been reserved. Sector C for the elderly, Sector F for widows and orphaned families, Sector H for medical cases. Wool-coated nurses checked for children under 10 and older evacuees who required blankets on the convoy benches, while American military police supervised the outer perimeter to prevent civilians from boarding without being logged into the manifest. Near the inspection table, where clerks assigned cloth luggage tags to suitcases, a widowed woman waited with her ration booklet open to the required page. Her suitcase rested against her boots, and though she looked at the chalkboard only once, she had already memorized the relevant codes for her district. The guards at the table asked for papers without ceremony, and the civilians ahead of her passed through the inspection point quickly, receiving stamped convoy slips and instructions to wait near the benches for seat roll. Engines rumbled beyond the freight shed, where trucks were parked in rows, warming for departure under the supervision of a U.S. convoy sergeant who carried a clipboard and shouted instructions to soldiers handling the tarpaulin covers. Nothing in the yard resembled peacetime travel. Movement was no longer leisure, but allocation, measured by fuel, billets, blankets, and the fragile arithmetic of winter logistics. The widow cleared her throat gently, preparing to present her documents when signaled, and the queue shifted forward with the same tired efficiency that wartime civilians learned to perform without complaint. The guard extended his hand for the widow's ration booklet, flipped through the identity pages, and paused at the surname printed beneath the relocation stamp, not long enough to constitute accusation, but long enough to interrupt the rhythm of processing that had moved the queue forward just moments earlier. Instead of returning the booklet to her, or stamping the convoy slip, he closed it, pointed toward a row of supply crates stacked near the freight shed, and said, "Verification," in a tone civilians recognized as both final and vague. The widow obeyed without question, carrying her suitcase to the crates and standing beside a bundle of rope coils that smelled of tar and snow, while the next civilian stepped forward and presented their papers without interruption. No clerk announced the nature of her verification, and no guard clarified whether she was disqualified, delayed, or merely misplaced within the system of categories that governed evacuation in winter. The queue continued to inch toward the inspection table, civilians receiving stamped convoy slips, cloth luggage tags, and instructions to take their seats near the benches for roll call, while the widow remained beside the crates, exposed to wind that carried coal smoke from the convoy engines into the open yard. After several minutes, she asked a clerk whether her relocation stamp was invalid, but the clerk merely replied, "Housing classification mismatch," before returning to the inspection table without explanation. Housing classification referred to municipal billets at interior facilities, not convoy eligibility, and a mismatch could be corrected later. Yet the crowd around her interpreted the phrase as something closer to disqualification. A pair of women at the front of the queue whispered that she should not have pushed forward if her papers were unclear, and a man behind them remarked that the convoy was already over capacity and that they cannot take everyone, implying that verification was simply the polite term for removal. The widow pressed her gloved hand against her suitcase handle, not from fear, but because the body required occupation when the mind was denied information. Each family that completed inspection and walked toward the benches represented one fewer seat available for the convoy, and civilians understood that convoy seats were a finite resource determined by fuel, not compassion. A clerk emerged from the registration hut, carrying her ration booklet, and spoke briefly with the guards at the inspection table while pointing at the housing classification field. And although none of the exchange was audible, the gesture of pointing at her surname rather than at her stamp was enough for onlookers to assume that the issue lay not in policy, but in the woman herself. No one announced her status, and no one invited her to rejoin the line. She remained beside the supply crates, while the queue thinned, the breeze stiffened, and the convoy engines warmed for departure, suspended in the limbo between paperwork and silence that wartime bureaucracies produced without malice, yet with considerable consequence. Rumor behaved like weather in station yards during the war. It drifted without owner, settled wherever civilians gathered, and altered the temperature of a space faster than any official announcement could. When the clerk returned the widow's ration booklet to the inspection table and whispered to the guards while pointing at the surname and housing classification fields, the gesture lasted only seconds, yet it yielded a narrative the queue adopted instantly. A man near the freight shed raised his voice first, claiming the widow was the collaborator's wife, and insisted that she was attempting to reach the Americans for protection. None of these claims appeared on her paperwork, yet paperwork mattered only at the tables. Rumor mattered everywhere else. A group of civilians near the benches shifted away from the supply crates, where the widow waited, widening the distance not out of hostility, but out of survival instinct, because proximity to someone under verification risked association, and association risked delay. Verification and contamination had become synonyms in civilian vocabularies during the war, especially in winter when convoys were scarce and seats were fewer than requests. The widow did not respond to the accusations, partly because she could not hear all of them over the convoy engines, and partly because explanations held no jurisdiction once rumor had replaced policy. A pair of young men shouted that her husband had worn the wrong uniform, and therefore she should not take the seats of real locals. And although neither had access to any roster confirming such claims, the uniform politics required no records to gain traction. A woman farther up the queue suggested that the widow should wait for review in a different district, a phrase civilians used when they believed someone should not receive benefits within their own jurisdiction. The widow attempted once more to approach the inspection table when two civilians left, but she was blocked by a guard who did not make contact, merely raising his hand and instructing her to remain beside the crates until clerks resolved administrative conflicts. The phrase contained no accusation, yet the crowd translated it into guilt. A teenage boy carrying a bundle of blankets shouted that she sought American seats, implying that U.S. transport personnel would override local policy for those they favored. And although the accusation was incorrect, it carried emotional accuracy for a crowd accustomed to believing that intervention changed outcomes more than paperwork did. No one asked to see her relocation stamp. No one asked whether her husband had been conscripted rather than voluntary in his service. Rumor simplified complexity into category: collaborator's wife, enemy's woman, outsider. The convoy engines revved louder as drivers tested throttle for departure, and the sound served as reminder that seats were quantified by fuel and barrels, not by empathy, and therefore civilians measured eligibility through scarcity logic, not fairness. Under such logic, if the widow gained a seat, someone else lost one, and rumor defined who was allowed to compete for scarcity. The widow kept her hands upon the suitcase handle, steady and upright, but while the space around her expanded into a small, social quarantine, enforced not by guards, but by onlookers who interpreted distance as verdict. The chalkboard listed her district code among those permitted for extraction, yet the chalkboard held less authority than voices in the yard. In wartime, paperwork decided movement, but rumor decided morale, and in station yards morale often won the first round. Beyond the freight shed, where trucks idled beneath canvas covers and soldiers carried crates of field rations toward the convoy benches. An American sergeant, responsible for departure readiness, scanned the yard with the administrative attention of someone trained to observe movement rather than drama. He checked watch lists, confirmed fuel logs with a motor pool corporal, and shouted instructions to a private adjusting a tarpaulin seam near the exhaust pipe. But his gaze returned often to the civilian queue, because departure procedures relied on accurate head counts and timely boarding. Civilians who failed to present themselves when called delayed the entire convoy, compelling transport units to track anomalies as carefully as luggage. When the sergeant noticed a gap near the supply crates, one civilian standing alone, while others refused proximity, he assumed initially that the widow belonged to a different category awaiting medical screening. Yet, no medical personnel approached her, no nurse checked her district code, and no clerk requested blankets on her behalf. Instead, the pattern resembled social quarantine. Civilians kept distance, guards performed minimal intervention, and rumor completed the exclusion. Such patterns were not uncommon in winter yards where relocation categories intersected with personal histories, but they posed logistical problems because excluded civilians either delayed seat roll or were removed from boarding without paperwork. The sergeant approached the registration hut under pretense of verifying numbers with the clerk. Bunn scanned the manifests pinned to the wall and noted that the housing classification for her district corresponded with the same extraction sector listed on the chalkboard. Nothing in the ledger marked her for denial. He inquired whether the convoy held enough blankets for the bench sector, and a quartermaster confirmed surplus. Yet, when he asked a guardsman why the widow had been separated, the guard answered only, "Administrative conflict," and gestured toward the crates without elaboration. Administrative conflicts rarely involved widows with proper relocation stamps. They involved missing birth records, incorrect ages for unaccompanied minors, or foreigners lacking district endorsements. The sergeant motioned toward the widow's ration booklet, which lay closed upon the table, and the guardsman handed it to him. The booklet carried the widow's surname, relocation stamp, district code, and widow's classification that granted eligibility for convoy evacuation. Nothing within the pages justified quarantine, and nothing in convoy policy defined rumor as grounds for exclusion. Rumor altered morale but held no authority over manifests, and manifests determined fuel allocation, seating capacity, and billet arrangements at interior facilities. The sergeant closed the booklet, returned it to the table, and observed the crowd once more. The distance between the widow and the rest of the civilians had widened. No insults were shouted now, but silence functioned as verdict. The clerk at the inspection table had stopped glancing toward the crates, as though the widow had been transferred to a different jurisdiction, even though no paperwork confirmed such transfer. Convoy engines roared briefly, as drivers synchronized throttle for warm-up, and the sergeant understood the timeline. If the widow's status remained unclarified before seat roll, she would be left in the yard without manifest entry, not through policy, but through omission. In wartime logistics, omission accomplished what denial could not be bothered to write. The sergeant stepped away from the freight shed and crossed the yard with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to solving logistical problems before they became delays. And when he reached the inspection table, he requested the widow's ration booklet from the clerk without raising his voice. Clerks did not outrank transport personnel during boarding windows, and the clerk surrendered the booklet immediately. The sergeant opened it beneath the dim light of a blackout lamp, confirmed the widow's relocation stamp, widow's classification code, and district housing endorsement, then tapped the F designation, indicating widows and orphan families, for the clerk to observe. "Sector F rides today," he said, a statement of scheduling rather than sympathy. The clerk hesitated, then explaining that civilians had raised concerns regarding the surname and that housing classification may require review. But the sergeant reminded him that billet review occurred upon arrival at interior facilities and did not affect convoy boarding. The clerk relented on policy grounds, not moral ones, and reached for the stamp that authorized convoy slips. The sergeant handed the ration booklet to the guardsman and motioned with 2 fingers toward the supply crates where the widow waited. The guardsman nodded, walked across the yard, and instructed her to present herself at the inspection table. Civilians watched as she lifted her suitcase and returned to the table, some whispering that the Americans were interfering, though interference was the incorrect term. The Americans enforced convoy protocol because convoys belonged to them, and protocol recognized classification before rumor. The sergeant asked for the widow's surname and district, verified that both matched the booklet, then requested her identity card to confirm birth year and sector eligibility. Once verified, he placed the convoy slip in front of the clerk and said, "Stamp, Sector F." The clerk stamped without argument, initialed the slip and passed it to the sergeant, who folded it once and returned it to the widow along with the ration booklet and identity card. "See it roll in 10, he said, indicating that benches would soon be called for boarding. Civilians murmured disapproval, not because the procedure was incorrect, but because intervention had overridden rumor. A woman near the benches asked loudly whether there was room for locals if Americans fill the convoy with outsiders, and the question spread down the line, becoming accusation without documentation. The sergeant did not respond to the speculation. Instead, he extended his hand toward the widow's suitcase and inspected the luggage tag field, noting that it remained blank. He instructed a clerk to issue a cloth luggage tag, and the clerk did so quickly, tying it to the handle and marking the serial number upon the manifest sheet. Administrative acts replaced rumor with procedure, and procedure erased accusation more thoroughly than argument ever could. When the sergeant instructed the widow to stand near the benches with the rest of Sector F evacuees, 2 civilians shifted away to avoid proximity, but the sergeant gestured with his clipboard for them to close the gap. "Seating order holds," he said, meaning that personal preferences did not override roll call. Rumor had separated the widow. Paperwork and protocol now returned her to the manifest. Engines idled, blankets were distributed, and the convoy neared departure with one less omission to account for. Once the convoy slip had been stamped and the luggage tag secured, the widow followed the guardsman toward the benches designated for Sector F, where evacuees waited beneath a canvas awning that had been tied to freight hooks along the shed wall. Nurses from the relief unit moved between benches distributing wool blankets to older civilians and confirming that infants and children under 10 had been assigned space near the inner benches where wind exposure was lowest. The widow found an empty span of bench beside an elderly woman holding a wrapped loaf of hard bread, and though no one invited her to sit, they did not prevent it either. Proximity was tolerated once paperwork replaced rumor. The sergeant conferred with the clerk responsible for seat roll, verifying total head count, luggage tags, and manifest entries for each sector. A corporal called for medical exceptions and received one request for a stretcher transfer, which was denied due to fuel constraints, and the request was reclassified as seated with blanket, a compromise the nurse accepted. The widow observed these exchanges without comment, adjusting her gloves and keeping her suitcase between her boots, as civilians had been advised to prevent luggage from being mistakenly loaded onto the wrong truck. When the clerk shouted, "Sector F to seat roll," the benches rose together and formed a line toward the boarding ramp where drivers checked luggage tags against the manifest. The widow presented her convoy slip to the corporal at the ramp, who read the stamp, verified the serial number, and handed it back with the instruction, "Right side, second bench." The widow climbed into the truck bed using the wooden steps that had been nailed to the side panel, careful to avoid catching her coat on the exposed nails at the rail. Soldiers distributed additional blankets along the benches, and the sergeant moved between trucks, confirming that all Sector F entries matched the manifest sheet. Before the widow's truck was closed, the sergeant asked the corporal whether any unassigned civilians remained at the ramp, and the corporal confirmed that the only remaining anomaly was collaborator rumor earlier, referring to the widow. Resolved by slip, the sergeant replied, indicating that convoy authority prioritized stamped paperwork over speculation. A soldier secured the tarpaulin flap at the rear of the truck, and the convoy engines throttled in sequence as drivers prepared to exit the yard in staggered formation. Civilians outside the canvas curtains watched as the trucks pulled forward, some silent, some whispering that Americans take whomever they want, though the convoy manifest had simply enforced classification codes posted on the chalkboard hours earlier. As the trucks turned toward the street leading to the interior districts, the widow felt the weight of her suitcase settle beneath the bench and the warmth of the blanket across her knees. No one spoke to her. No one thanked the Americans, and no one apologized for the distance earlier. Wartime travel required no acknowledgments beyond paperwork. The convoy did not represent victory, rescue, or absolution, only movement from one texture of survival to another. And in winter, movement itself was mercy enough. When the convoy trucks reached the interior district's relief compound, flood lamps illuminated the yard in muted amber, revealing lines of temporary huts and the long shadow of the administrative tent where arrivals were processed for housing and ration assignment. The tarp at the rear of the truck was unfastened, and the corporal called numbers based on the seat roll, ensuring that civilians disembarked according to manifest order rather than eagerness or hierarchy. When the widow's number was read, she stepped down onto the compacted snow with her suitcase in hand, blanket folded across her arm, and ration booklet tucked beneath her glove. Inside the administrative tent, a clerk logged new arrivals by matching convoy slips against the master ledger for District Sector F. And when the widow handed over her stamped papers, the clerk scanned them without hesitation, wrote her name in full, and asked only one procedural question: bunk or cot, indicating that the housing tent had both. No clerk paused at her surname, no rumor was invited, and no public commentary attempted to reinterpret her eligibility. Classification had finally outranked gossip. A nurse affixed a small cloth tag to the widow's coat, marked with the hut number and row assignment, then issued the standard newcomer packet: one tin cup, one ration token for evening broth, and a folded wool blanket with the initials of a relief unit stitched into the corner. As the widow exited the administrative tent toward the rows of huts, she noticed the sergeant standing near the convoy trucks reviewing fuel records and departure schedules for the return trip, clipboard tucked under his arm. He did not call to her, did not summon acknowledgement, and did not assume gratitude. He only glanced long enough to confirm that she had passed through the correct gate and into the correct district shelter. The recognition was not verbal, but procedural. Her name existed now in ledgers that mattered, not in whispers that circulated through cold station yards. Inside Hut C3, she found her assigned cot near the central stove, where other women quietly arranged suitcases beneath metal frames and folded blankets atop coarse mattresses. A member of the relief staff asked whether anyone required medical attention or additional broth tokens, and the widow shook her head. The staff member nodded and moved on without prying into her surname, her past district, or her marital status. When the hut lights dimmed for curfew, the women settled beneath blankets, and the stove ticked as it cooled, the hut absorbing the sound of controlled breathing from a dozen survivors who had been strangers that morning and evacuees by nightfall. No one labeled her this time. No one demanded explanation, and no one assigned her to a category she could not defend. Her existence had been restored, not through sentiment, but through paperwork, seat roll, and orderly processing. Mechanisms that wartime society trusted, more than fairness, yet occasionally delivered dignity as a byproduct. Curfew bells sounded across the compound, muffled by canvas roofs and snowfall, and the relief staff walked from hut to hut, lowering lantern wicks to half flame, while reminding newcomers to keep boots and coats within arm's reach in case of night inspections or emergency roll calls. Wartime routines that no longer startled civilians, but structured their nights the way prayer once structured their mornings. The widow lay beneath her issued blanket on the narrow cot, suitcase wedged beneath the frame, ration booklet tucked into her coat pocket for safekeeping. Not because she expected to be asked for it again tonight, but because civilians had learned that documentation often slept closer than family. Nearby, a woman whispered district names to her child to help him fall asleep, and another traced her finger along the seam of her blanket as though following a map from memory. The stove at the hut's center radiated a low, steady warmth that smelled faintly of coal dust and boiled cabbage, the universal scent of temporary safety in war. In the yard outside, convoy engines idled for a brief inspection before shutting down, and the silhouettes of military police crossed between fuel drums and registration tents with clipboards instead of rifles, checking head counts and fuel logs before the return trip. When the widow finally closed her eyes, she did not replay the insults from the station yard, nor the moment the rope separated her from the queue. Instead, she replayed the administrative stamp that had replaced rumor with category, and the quiet physical gesture of the sergeant stepping between her and the crowd without raising his voice or demanding recognition. Safety had not arrived in the form of heroism, nor victory, nor patriotic speeches. It had arrived as seating assignment, housing ledger, blanket, and curfew bell. Mundane, unadorned, and undeniably real. In the morning, the compound would post updated relocation lists outside the mess tent, and newcomers would queue with tin cups to collect broth before inspection teams transferred them to the next district or settled them into work allocations. The widow would carry her suitcase across the yard with the others and wait for her name to be spoken without hesitation or accusation. She would not be celebrated, and she would not be pitied. She would be processed, which in this particular chapter of history was the closest many civilians came to being respected. Outside the wire, the war continued across cities and fields she would never see, carried by rail timetables and casualty reports, rather than by the opinions of station crowds. Inside the compound, the widow slept without the label they had tried to attach to her, and when morning arrived, she would wake not as enemy's woman, but as a registered evacuee whose papers matched her district and whose dignity, quiet, administrative, and unremarked, had survived the journey.